Okay, I guess we'll get started. I'm going to start with some review, so people trickling in a little late won't really miss much. So I think last time we met, which was 2 weeks ago now, we covered the fiat Shamir transformation, which is a way to take any interactive protocol that's public coin and transform it into a non-interactive one using cryptographic hash functions. So that's kind of a self-contained topic, and I did, it wasn't my best showing, I think, last Thursday's session, but hopefully the way the transformation works came across, and kind of what the optimal attacks are also came across, and maybe some of the pitfalls to be aware of where that attack can actually be effective if you're not careful enough about the soundness of the interactive thing that you're applying the transformation to. And in certain settings, like with many round interactive protocols, there can actually be security issues when you apply fiat Shamir, even if the interactive thing is very sound. There can be a major loss in soundness in terms of the number of rounds of the interactive protocol. So that is what we discussed last time. So today we're going to go back to designing interactive protocols, which actually are known to be secure, despite having many rounds, when you apply fiat Shamir to them. So yeah, I want to cover something called the GKR interactive proof for circuit evaluation. GKR stands for the initials of the authors, Goldwasser, Kalai, and Rothblum, who gave the protocol in 2007, or I guess it was formally published in 2008. This is actually possibly the most complicated protocol like we'll cover in this whole reading group. And if you don't follow all the details, it doesn't really matter like moving forward. But I think it is worth covering now, mainly because of the problem it solves. I mean, I think it is a really important protocol in practice too. But this circuit evaluation problem that it solves, I really want to be able to kind of invoke an interactive proof for circuit evaluation moving forward. And so this is the one. This is the one to cover. Okay. So before I dive into how the GKR protocol works, I do want to briefly review the notion of multilinear Lagrange interpolation, which was covered in, I think, chapter 3 of the book, and probably maybe, I don't know, four-ish meetings ago of the reading group. And so I'll try to make that quick because it's review, and then we'll dive into the GKR protocol. Does anyone want to ask a question right now? As usual, can someone confirm you can see my screen and hear me?
Yep, all good.
Great, thanks. All right. Okay, so yeah, multilinear Lagrange interpolation. Let me actually start by reminding you what is a multilinear extension. Okay, of let's say of a vector. So let I don't know, let's say W be a vector of length n with entries from some finite field. And I want to refer to the multilinear extension, also known as the MLE of W. And it's a little weird to talk about multilinear extensions of vectors for reasons I'll remind you about shortly, but it actually is, once you get used to it, it turns out to be very natural and very, this is basically what interactive proofs do, right and left. So the multilinear extension, MLE, of W is defined as follows. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is interpret W not as a vector of length n, but as a function mapping 0, 1 to the log n, where the base of the logarithm is 2, to the field. And in the natural way, which I'll go over quickly because this should be a review, so we sort of rather than indexing entries of W by sort of numbers between 0 and n minus 1, we'll instead index them by bit vectors of length log n. They're exactly n bit vectors of length log n. So, it doesn't really matter if you index by integers between 0 and n minus 1 or index by bit vectors of length log n. And in a natural way. So like W, this function evaluated at, the following log n bits, we just take to be, and here's me using notation, but W, the ith entry of W, where I is like the integer corresponding to these bits. So j equals 1 to log n of 2 to the j minus 1 times ij. So this is just interpreting I as an integer in the natural way, and defining, the function evaluated at these log n bits to be the associated entry of W. Okay. Please ask a question if any of this is unclear. And W twiddle, the multilinear extension. I denote multilinear extensions by sticking a twiddle over the function or the vector. Is defined to be the unique multilinear polynomial. Multilinear means degree at most 1 in each variable, such that if you evaluate the polynomial at a Boolean input, meaning all entries are in 0, 1, everything you feed into it is in 0, 1, then it spits out that W twiddle at that bit vector spits out the same thing that W did at that bit vector. Again, interpreting W here as a function on log n bits. So W twiddle and W agree wherever W is defined. So whenever I1 to I log n is a bit vector. Okay. Keep in mind, like, the multilinear extension is it's a polynomial, so you can evaluate W twiddle at points that are not Boolean. We get you feed in any vector of field elements and you get out a field element. So W twiddle is defined over a much bigger domain than W. W is defined over log n bits. W twiddle is defined over log n field elements. And think of your field, as size, 2 to the 127, 2 to the 256, or something like that. So, field to the log n is vastly bigger than 0, 1 to the log n. Okay. And then Lagrange interpolation gave an explicit expression for W twiddle as follows. So W twiddle of R, and remember, it's a log n variate polynomial. So you sum over all Boolean inputs. So I1 to I log n in 0, 1 to the log n, right? And we often call 0, 1 to the log n the so-called interpolating set. So basically we're defining here a polynomial W twiddle on the right-hand side, specifically so that it takes a prescribed value where that prescribed value is given by the associated entry of W, the thing we're taking the multi-linear extension of, at every point in the interpolated set. Okay. So, the term of the sun corresponding to points, I in the interpolating set is the ith entry of W. Again, I'm sort of abusing notation here. And maybe I should say W of I, since I said we're viewing W now as a function whose domain is 0, 1 log n. So Wi times what's called the ith Lagrange basis polynomial evaluated at R. Okay, and here Chi of R is defined. I'll give an explicit expression for that in a second, but it's defined so that if you evaluate it at a Boolean vector, it equals 1 if I equals I prime and 0 otherwise. And this equation holds. If I prime, I prime is in 0 as a bit vector. Okay, so right, just as we're like the whole point of multilinear Lagrange interpolation is to sort of express the multilinear extension W twiddle as like a polynomial, sort of a sum of these Lagrange basis polynomials. Where the coefficients are given by the evaluations of W, the thing we're extending. And as I'll explain shortly, and again, this is all for review, we're sort of coming up with this sum specifically to ensure that W twiddle of I equals W of I whenever I is a bit vector, that is in the interpolated set. And similarly, we are defining like the Lagrange basis polynomials, and there's one for each I in the interpolating set, also via how they should behave over the interpolated set. So it's kind of like W twiddle. We're giving an expression for W twiddle in terms of its behavior over the interpolating set. And then these Lagrange basis polynomials that arise in the expression themselves are sort of defined via interpolation over the interpolating set. All of that said, I can very easily give an explicit expression for the ith Lagrange basis polynomial. So Chi of R1 to R log n, where remember here I is in 0, 1 to the log n. It is just the product over all log n coordinates, so that's j equals 1 to log n of let's see, it's rj times ij plus 1 minus rj times 1 minus ij. Okay. And the way to think about the jth term here is it's sort of testing, like if RJ were in 0, 1, this term would be testing that RJ equals IJ, if RJ is in 0, 1. So what's happening here is if RJ and IJ are both 1, then this term RJ times IJ is 1, and this term is 0. So you get the term that's equaling 1, indicating that RJ and IJ are equal. I think we're getting some background noise from someone, just FYI. And then if RJ and IJ are both 0, then this term will be 1, and the other term will be 0. Their sum will be 1, which is exactly what we want. They're both equal to 0. That is, they equal each other. Whereas if RJ is 0 and IJ is 1, or vice versa, both of these terms will be 0 because you'll get 1 0 in both terms. And so this is what I mean by testing that RJ equals IJ is the jth term spits out or equals 1 if RJ equals IJ, and 0 otherwise. And so the product of all the terms spits out 1 if RJ equals IJ for every coordinate J, and spits out 0 if there's even 1 coordinate at which they differ. And in that way, we ensure, like we have now checked basically, that GI of I prime has exactly the behavior we want, right? So it equals 1 if I and I prime are the same, and 0 if they disagree in even a single coordinate. And this is assumed, all of these calculations assume that I prime wasn't 0, 1 to the log n. So that is the definition of the ith Lagrange basis polynomial. It's just sort of a product over terms, over variables, the log n variables, of some term that just sort of looks at the jth variable of the input and confirms it equals the jth variable of I, assuming here that the input is in 0, 1 to the log n. So that's the ith Lagrange basis polynomial. And then W twiddle was defined to be this weighted sum of Lagrange basis polynomials, where the weight of the ith term of the sum is just W of I. Okay, and what's happening, so the way to confirm formally that the right-hand side is the multilinear extension of W is to check 2 things. So you have to check 1, that the right-hand side is multilinear, and 2, that the right-hand side has the appropriate behavior at all Boolean inputs, right? And because the multilinear extension of any function defined over domain 0, 1 to log n is unique, if you ever look at any polynomial and it's multilinear and has the appropriate behavior over the interpolated set, it must be the multilinear extension. Okay, and so let's just quickly check 1 and 2. So 1 holds just because the right-hand side is like a weighted sum of multilinear polynomials, because each Lagrange basis polynomial is multilinear and has degree only 1 in each variable. You can just sort of look at this product and check that, right? Each variable appears in one term of the product and has degree 1 in that term, right? Like RJ times IJ has degree 1 in RJ, and 1 minus RJ times 1 minus IJ has degree 1 in RJ, and if you sum them together, still have degree 1 in RJ, and that's the only term RJ appears in. So each Lagrange basis polynomial is multilinear. So one holds, the right-hand side is multilinear. And then for checking that the right-hand side has the appropriate behavior over the interpolated set, the way to see that is to observe that if you sort of evaluate the right-hand side at any point I in the interpolated set, okay, every Lagrange basis polynomial evaluated at I spits out 0, except for the Lagrange basis polynomial corresponding to I itself, and that spits out 1. So if you feed into W twiddle any Boolean vector I, so you set R1 to R log n here to be I, okay, every term of the sum equals 0, except for the ith term of the sum, okay, where chi of I is 1, and you multiply that by W of I, so you get out W of I, which is exactly what we wanted. Okay, so that is my review of multilinear Lagrange interpolation. It's just an explicit expression for the multilinear extension of a vector. And the way, the expression is as like a weighted sum of Lagrange basis polynomials. And once I write down that expression, the way to check that indeed the expression is accurate, that is, the right-hand side here is the multilinear extension, is to check that the right-hand side is multilinear and that it has the appropriate behavior at all points in the interpolating set. Okay, that's the review. Does anyone want to ask a question? Okay. So that technique of kind of giving an explicit expression for the multilinear extension of some vector is going to come up repeatedly as I describe the GKR protocol to you. Okay. But before I can describe the GKR protocol to you, I have to describe what problem it solves. So the GKR protocol solves the problem of arithmetic circuit evaluation. So I have to tell you what that is. Okay. So in arithmetic circuit evaluation, the prover and the verifier are going to agree in advance on some circuit C over a field F. And what that means is the inputs to the circuit, I'll draw a picture in a second, but the inputs to the circuit are field elements, and let's say they're n of n. So the input, let's just call the input is x in field to the n. Okay, so both the prover and the verifier know x. So the input is what we call public. The public just means it's known to both the prover and the verifier. Okay, and so what is a circuit? So I'll just draw an example from the book. So let's say this is the input. So let's say that n is 4. So there are 4 inputs. So that's just 4 field elements. So let's say these are each field elements. So an arithmetic circuit is a bunch of gates connected by wires. Okay. Now the gates compute addition and multiplication over the field. Right, so in the example I'm copying from the book, let's say maybe here's a multiplication gate which squares the first input. So it has, these are wires. These are wires that there are 2 wires here, each of which is feeding the first input into this multiplication gate. And the multiplication gate just like multiplies the values that are fed into it. Similarly, this multiplication gate would be squaring the second input. Here's another multiplication gate which multiplies the second input by the third input. And here's a multiplication gate which, let's say, squares the fourth input. Okay, and now let's say here's an addition gate which computes the sum of these 2 multiplication gates that I just drew wires, from them to this addition gate. And here's another addition gate which computes the sum of the other 2 multiplication gates. Okay, and let's declare these final 2 gates that I just drew, these addition gates, let's declare these both to be output gates. So output gates are just outputs. Most people will call these outputs, but in the book I call them output gates. Probably confuses some readers, but that's how I think about them. Everything's a gate. Like an input is a gate, an output is a gate, and the intermediate gates are also gates. The gate, the gates that are neither inputs nor outputs, are also gates. So this circuit would output, let me just evaluate the circuit by hand here. So this gate would have value 9, this gate would have value 4, it's like this gate would have value 6, this one would have value 1, then 9 plus 4 is 13, and 6 plus 1 is 7. So this circuit on this input, so let's call the circuit C of X here would be 13, 7. Right? It's just the list of outputs, 13 and 7. Okay, does that make sense? Any questions? All right.
Makes sense.
Great, okay, thank you for confirming. Yeah. Again, anyone, please jump in with questions. If you have a question, I guarantee you others do as well. And,
Can you explain why it's addition and multiplication only?
It's just the convention. We'll see. It kind of makes the circuit amenable to interactive proofs, but this is just the field comes equipped by definition with 2 operations: addition and multiplication. So if I tell you, what are the simplest operations you could do to field elements? They're addition and multiplication, right? It does make sense to consider, potentially consider more sophisticated gate types. Like you could have a gate that gate type, I don't know, I call it, like to the fourth power gate, which takes as input like a single field element, and spits out the fourth power of that. Okay, that can actually be advantageous in some settings to do in practice, because rather than having, two multiplication gates, one, to typically people work with circuits of Fanon 2. Fanon means how many wires can get fed into them. So rather than having two multiplication gates, to one computes x squared, and then if you square that, you get x to the fourth. We can just have one fourth power gate. And if you apply certain SMARCs that can handle, fourth power gates, their cost when applied to one fourth power gate might be smaller than their cost when applied to two multiplication gates. So there can be reasons, like in practice even, to consider more complicated gate sets. But it's just, if you want the simplest possible gate set, given that the inputs are all field elements, it would just be addition and multiplication. This is actually the use of, like the very first paper I ever wrote on this topic way back in like 2012, explored this. I think as did another paper that came out the same year. And people, the modern manifestation of this is to look at like Planckish arithmetization and air, where people kind of go crazy with what they call custom constraints, or which are basically at very high level. They amount to just considering gates that can do more than add or multiply two numbers. They can do things like take the fourth power or something, and there can be performance benefits for that. Basically, you can make the circuit smaller, fewer gates, by allowing the gates to do more complicated things than just addition and multiplication, roughly speaking. And that can make your circuit smaller and hence buy you a faster prover and stuff like that. Was that a clear enough rambling answer?
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Other questions? Cool. Okay, let's see what I want to say next. Let me just remind myself. So I think we know the problem we want to solve now. So I think I'm just ready to sort of start introducing the notation I need for the protocol. Yeah, so I mean, in the protocol, right, like so again, there's a circuit C. Prover and verifier have sort of agreed in advance what C is going to be. There's a public input X, so both of them know what X is, both of them know what C is. And like the prover sends to the verifier some Y claimed to equal C evaluated at input X. And the verifier doesn't trust that the prover's honest, so the verifier needs to sort of use an interactive proof to confirm that that's indeed the case. And Y in general can be a vector. If there are two output gates, Y will consist of two field elements. If there's 5 output gates, Y will be a vector of 5 field elements, and so forth. Okay, so what I'm going to need to do is introduce notation, which is going to take about 5 to 7 minutes, I think. It's a little unfortunate that there's a bunch of notation to describe the protocol, but once I get through the notation, the protocol is actually reasonably fast to describe. Okay, so before I introduce the notation, let me give a very, very high-level overview of how the protocol will work. I'll use this example circuit here to give the high-level overview, right? So the protocol starts with the prover sending the claimed values of the output gates, okay? And the very first thing the verifier is going to do is it's sort of annoying if there are many outputs, the verifier doesn't really want to have to deal with many outputs. So the first thing it's going to do is evaluate. Okay, we're going to take the vector of claimed outputs. So I think I called that Y. We're going to consider its multilinear extension. And the very first thing the verifier is going to do is evaluate the multilinear extension of these claimed outputs at a random point. Let me call it R0, but remember R0, the number of entries in R0 is log base 2 of the number of outputs. Let me call the number of outputs, I don't know, O. Many coordinates, many variables in R0. Okay, and in this is like exactly what the verifier in our like interactive proof from several weeks ago for matrix multiplication did, right? If you remember, the prover, would send the claim product matrix C, and the verifier would immediately, like the very first thing it would do is would pick a random R1, R2 in the appropriate length vectors and evaluate the multilinear extension of that at R1, R2. And then we just, we said, hey, like, if the prover sent, if C did not equal the true output matrix, then by the Short-Zipfel lemma, when the verify, basically with up to some very small soundness error, confirming that C equals the true product matrix is equivalent to just evaluating, confirming that the true product matrix multilinear extension and C's multilinear extension agree at a random point. So another way to think about this is, these are fingerprints. Like going back to kind of our second or third meeting, we talked about like fingerprinting is like a randomized procedure to test whether two large objects are equal. So you sort of, if they are equal, the fingerprints will always match, and if they're not equal, the large objects, the fingerprints will disagree with overwhelming probability. So kind of, in order to know whether, the claims of the vector of outputs y equals the true vector of outputs, it's going to be enough to confirm that, if you evaluate the multilinear extension at a random point for y, that equals the the true vector of outputs evaluated at the same random point. Okay, so so that's the first thing the verifier does is it just evaluates the multilinear extension of the claimed outputs at a random point. The prover and verifier will then invoke the sum check protocol, and at the end of the sum check protocol, the prover will be essentially forced to make a claim about the multilinear extension of my pen died for 1 second. What's going on? Basically, the prover and verifier use the sum check protocol to reduce the prover's claims about the output of the circuit to an equivalent claim about the gates feeding into the output layer. Right. So if we call this vector, and this is actually the notation I'm going to use. So y, I'm really going to call W0 rather than y when I introduce notation in a moment. So this vector for the gates feeding into the output, I'm going to call this W1. Okay. And the sum check protocol will basically be used to reduce the claim about y twiddle of R0 to a claim about W1 twiddle of R1. So that is, we're going to wind up reducing the claim about the outputs to an analogous claim about the gates feeding into the outputs. Okay. Now, unfortunately, the verifier can't check this claim about the gates feeding into the outputs on its own without evaluating all those gates itself, which is almost as hard as evaluating the whole circuit, because at this point we've only kind of cut off one layer, the output layer of the circuit. So, evaluating the entire circuit up until, but not including the outputs, is almost as hard as evaluating the outputs themselves, right? All we've done is cut off these final two gate evaluations since there are two outputs. So we're not done. Okay, so the verifier has made some progress, because rather than having a claim about the outputs, it's moved one layer of the circuit closer to the inputs. Okay, so we just apply the same sum check protocol again, and that reduces the claim about the gates feeding into the outputs to an analogous claim about the gates feeding into those gates, which in this example, because there are only, 3 layers of the circuit, is the inputs themselves. So the sum check protocol invoked, a second time, kind of forces the prover to make a claim about now the multilinear extension of the input vector evaluated at a new random point. Okay, and this claim, because it's a claim about the inputs, the verifier can check this claim on its own in order and time, because we've seen via like our fast algorithm for multilinear interpolation that there's an order n time algorithm for evaluating the multilinear extension of any vector of length n at a random point. And so that's how the protocol works. So just a couple clarifications there. When I say the claim about y twiddle of R0 is reduced to a claim about W1 twiddle of R1, what I mean is like it's safe for the verifier to believe the claim about y twiddle, so long as the verifier is led to believe the claim about W1 twiddle. Okay, and that's it's just like a fingerprinting sort of thing as well, right? Like if you take two vectors, I don't know, let's call them W and V, and you look at their sort of multilinear extension-based fingerprints, W twiddle of R and V twiddle of R. So you just evaluate the multilinear extensions at a random point. And we think of that as a fingerprint of W and a fingerprint of V. Kind of if their fingerprints match, it's safe to believe that W equals V. So right, if W twiddle of R equals V twiddle of R, it's sort of safe to believe that W equals V. And again, that's because if W didn't equal V, then by the Schwarzschild lemma with overwhelming probability over the choice of R, W twiddle of R would not equal V twiddle of R. So formally, it's like if W does not equal V, then with probability, W dot P is abbreviation for probability, at least 1 minus the number of their variables, let's say it's log n over field size. W twiddle of R does not equal V twiddle of R, where this probability is over the random choice of R. So same sort of thing is happening here, right? Like if Y twiddle is not the true output vector, then with overwhelming probability, W1 twiddle of R1 will not be equal to like the real value of these gates at this layer feeding into the output multilinear extension evaluated at R1. And so on and so forth. The prover will, with overwhelming probability, be sort of left with a false claim at each layer of the circuit until it finally gets to the input layer with a false claim, and the verifier checks that claim directly and picks up on the lie. Okay. So that's how, please ask a question, please.
Does the width to height ratio of this circuit affect the prover verifier time?
Great question. So it does not really affect the prover time too much. I'll explain that in a second, but it very much affects the verifier time. And in particular, the verifier will only be saving work here compared to evaluating the circuit itself with no help from the prover, if the circuit has sort of non-trivial width. Right, so it turns out that, let me just tell you what the cost of the protocol will wind up being. So the proof's length will be at most the depth of the circuit, so I'm going to call that D. This is the number of layers of the circuit, times log, so I normally just write log circuit size, which I'll use capital S to, I'll use kind of bar, absolute value around C to denote circuit size. It's actually a little bit better than that. It's really like log of the width of the circuit. And you can even give more refined bounds. This is like there's a cost for each layer. So like a really at each layer, what it really is the sum over all layers of log of the width of that layer. Right. So circuits. Anyway, that's more fine grained than you're going to get a pretty good, typically pretty tight upper bound just by saying order depth times log circuit size. Note that the width of any particular layer is obviously at most the total size of the whole circuit, which sort of sums up the width of all layers. So yeah. Anyway, I'll just say from now on, the proof length is depth times log circuit size. So basically, you apply the subject protocol once per layer. So there are D layers, and every time you apply the subject protocol, the proof length will be log of the width of that layer, which is at most log of the circuit size. Okay, and
I didn't pay attention for a second. So the circuit size is just the length of the inputs, right?
No. Thank you for asking that. No, the circuit size is the number of gates in the whole circuit, which could be much bigger than the number of inputs. So as an example, quick example, like if you, a circuit, like the natural circuit that implements naive matrix multiplication, right? Like its inputs specify let's say two n by n matrices. So you'd have n squared field elements specifying matrix A, like all entries of A. You've got similarly n squared field elements specifying all entries of B. Okay, and then what the circuit will do is it will, naive matrix multiplication is basically just like a for loop. For all I, for all J, for all K. The output Ij like plus equals Aik times Bkj, and you have to initialize like C to 0. C is like the all zeros matrix to start. So you wind up with n cubed multiplication gates, computing all of these products here. So the book has a picture of the circuit for matrix multiplication, but basically every multiplication gate has sort of one entry of A feeding into it and one entry of B feeding into it. So it's wired up in this very specific way, to capture these multiplications. And then you do the appropriate summations as well. So that winds up with logarithmically many layers of addition gates kind of adding up appropriate results of multiplications. Okay, so that, I did that very quickly. I do recommend you have a look in the book at I drew out the full circuit for like 2x2 naive matrix multiplication or whatever. But the point is that here the number of inputs is 2n squared, the size of the circuit, and this is like bad notation because before I said n was the input size, and here we're dealing with n by n matrices, so the input size is actually, I changed what n means just for this matrix multiplication example, but the circuit size is about n cubed. Right. So whenever the circuit is kind of implementing an algorithm that runs in superlinear time, the circuit will be the size of the circuit will be much bigger than the number of inputs. So I'm using C to denote circuit size and N to denote input size. Although again, in this matrix multiplication example, it was N squared was denoting input size there, but that was just because I was referring to N by N matrix multiplication. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so is C basically the first layer after the inputs, like right on top of the inputs?
So here, what by C I mean the whole circuit.
It's just weird because I would assume because you're multiplying the depth by the C, so I would think that you're multiplying the depth by the longest width layer.
Yeah. Okay. So what's actually it's because I wanted to give a simply stated down that's not necessarily completely tight. So what really happens is so you have these inputs and the circuit's broken into layers, and maybe like the first here's like the layers are getting bigger and bigger. That's certainly the case with this matrix multiplication. So and then in that example, you have some giant layer, and then the much smaller number of inputs feed into that. Okay, so the way the protocol, and here's X is let's say much smaller than that first layer. Let's say the way the protocol works is it goes layer by layer through the circuit. So first it sort of considers like the last two layers, then it considers the next two layers, then it considers the next two layers. And so every time it's considering two layers, it's only those two layers that contribute to the proof length. So like the proof length here would actually be about log of the width of the output layer, so log width of layer of this last layer plus roughly log width of the other layer under consideration. So every layer of the circuit, you sort of up to a constant factor, you only sort of that layer only contributes log of the width to the proof length. Okay, and I'm just very crudely saying, hey, if circuit size is the number of gates in all layers, so basically the sum of the widths of all layers, well, log of width of any particular layer is certainly at most log of circuit size. It's a very, very crude bound, but it's typically tight up to a constant factor anyway, because when you can take two numbers that are actually quite different in magnitude, and when you take the log of them, those logs will typically be like pretty close. Like for example, a million is vastly smaller than a trillion squared, right? But like a million is 2 to the 20, and a trillion squared is something like 2 to the 80. And so log of both is like 20 versus 80. They're related up to a factor of 4. So that's why, I'm being very crude here when I replace like sum over all layers of log of the width of that layer with just D times log circuit size. But it's less crude than you might otherwise think if you haven't seen, logarithms before. Log of circuit size, even if circuit size is much, much bigger than any individual layer, is still going to be like not that much bigger than like the actual proof length. Does that make sense?
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Okay, so this is a crude bound, but because log is like a kind of a greatly equalizing function, log of 2 to the 80 is not all that much bigger than log of 2 to the 20 or whatever. It turns out to not be, you're not losing that much when I write this. So the proof length is order depth times log circuit size. The verifier time, the verifier basically, more or less just has to read the proof, but it also has to process the input. And processing the input takes n time. N is the input size, right? And basically, it turns out the only information the verifier needs to know about the input is it has to evaluate the multilinear extension of the input at a random location. And we've seen, from like, a month or 6 weeks ago or something, that can be done in order n time. Okay. And then the prover time, it's known, it's not at all trivial. The prover time turns out to be order circuit size. And that's why the prover time doesn't really depend. Like you could have, imagine you had a circuit that was like super deep and narrow. Just like repeatedly squared, like one number. Something like that. I'm sort of drawing my circuit like in the opposite direction than I normally do, but whatever. Then the prover in the GKR protocol applied to the circuit will run in time linear in the size of the circuit, which up to a constant factor is no more expensive than just evaluating the circuit gate by gate in the first place. So the prover is like as good as we can hope for up to a constant factor. But if the circuit is just like, its depth is proportional to its size, then the verifier isn't saving any time by using the GKR protocol. It might as well just ignore the proof completely and evaluate the circuit on its own. Okay, so the GKR protocol, if you want to save the verifier time, the GKR protocol would only be useful for kind of small depth circuits. So depth certainly should be much less than circuit size. And if you want the verifier to run in linear time, order n time, you certainly would want the depth to be, like noticeably less than linear. So I did like less than n over log n or something. So that depth times log circuit size is less than n. Okay. But there are lots of circuits that do have depth like log n, And then if your circuit depth is like log n, then your verifier time is log squared n. Assuming the circuit's size polynomial in n, because then depth is log n and log circuit size is also order log n, so you get log squared size proofs, which concretely can be really big. But do keep in mind that people are using, for example, Fry every day today, and Fry also has log squared size proofs and actually has a pretty nasty hidden constant there. So yeah, the GKR protocol, like it does tend to have pretty big proofs compared to a lot of snarks today, but actually not really necessarily any bigger than some of the snarks people are using today. Okay. Okay, so those are the costs of the protocol, and we've now seen the high-level outline of it. Let me pause again for questions, and once we're done with any questions, I'll actually introduce all the notation I need, and then I think I'll try to cover the protocol, even though we're an hour in already. Yeah, so anyone want to ask anything else? Cool, okay. All right, so so let me give you the notation. So let me just draw an example circuit again. This circuit got pretty, messy. So I'll just draw the same circuit again. It won't take long. So the inputs are 3, 2, 3, 1. We have this multiplication gate squares the first input. This multiplication gate squares the second input. The next multiplication gate multiplies the second input by the third input, and the fourth multiplication gate squares the fourth input, and then we had two addition gates. And I had said, hey, when you actually evaluate the circuit gate by gate on this input, the values were, and I think I wrote it in red, 3 squared is 9, 2 squared is 4, 2 times 3 is 6, 1 squared is 1. The sum of 9 and 4 is 13, and the sum of 6 and 1 is 7. Good, okay. So I'm gonna call this vector W0. I'm gonna call this vector W1, and the so on and so forth, this vector W2. In general, if there are D layers of the circuit, like the input layer will be WD. And I'm still gonna call the input X. So this vector, this WD vector is just the input vector X. Okay. Any questions about that? Okay. Now remember, we talked about taking multilinear extension of vectors, right? And the multilinear extension is a polynomial over log of vector length many variables. So here W0 has length 2, and log base 2 of 2 is 1. So W0 will have us taken, will be a univariate polynomial. So I would just say W, and yeah, so I'm just looking at the book, and it looks like I made sorry. So the example in the book had this as a multiplication gate, not an addition gate. So I'll leave it as addition gate here. But yeah, apologies. If you look at the same figure I am in the book, it's actually different by one of the gates differs. So sorry about that. By definition, W0 twiddle of 0 will be 13, and W0 twiddle of 1 will be 7. Now W1 is a vector of length 4, so W1 twiddle will take, log base 2 of 4 is 2, so it'll be a bivariate polynomial. So W1 twiddle of 0, 0 will be 9, W1 twiddle of 0, 1 will be 4, so on. W1 twiddle of 1, 0 will be 6, and W1 twiddle of 1, 1 will be 1. So hopefully you get the idea. Great. So I only need to introduce 2 more polynomials, two more functions, and then I'm going to take the multilinear extension of both of them. So these functions, this is like kind of the nastiest part of the notation, but it's really not, once I describe it conceptually, it's actually quite simple, I hope. So the two functions are going to be called add and mult, but there's going to be one function like per layer of the circuit, add I and multi. Okay, and you should think add I and multi will take as input three gate labels, A, B, and C. And you should think of A as a label of a gate, as a binary label of a gate at layer I. And I hope I'm doing this the same way I did in the book. I never remember if it's layer I or I plus one. I think it's I, yeah. And B and C will each be a label of a gate at layer I plus one. Okay, and add I will just sort of indicate whether or not gate A is a summation gate and computes the sum of gates B and C. So add I will equal 1 if gate A at layer I computes the sum of gates B and C at layer I plus 1. And 0, it'll output 0 otherwise. So this function, and mult is the analog, but just focuses on multiplication gates, not addition gates. So it's the same thing, except the word sum turns into multiplication or product. So what's happening here is these add I and multi functions, they capture the circuit. They capture the wiring of the circuit and the gate operations of the circuit. Okay. So if I tell you add I and multi for every layer I of the circuit, I'm telling you the circuit. Okay. So for example, in this example up here, I guess, remember this gate, the left output gate, the first output gate, has label 0 for its layer, right? Because it's a 2-gate layer. So both gates are assigned, their binary label is either 0 or 1. And the first one is assigned label 0, and the second one is assigned label 1. This is gate 1 at layer 0. Similarly, this is gate 0, 0 at layer 1. This is gate 0, 1. At layer 1, this is gate 1, 0 at layer 1, this is gate 1, 1 at layer 1. This is gate 0, 0 at layer 2, 0, 1 at layer 2, so forth. So, to give some examples, like add, I guess 0, 0, 0, 0, 1 equals 1 because this 0, the gate with label 0 at layer 0 computes the sum of the gates with label 0, 0 and 0, 1 at layer 1. Okay, so similarly, like mult of 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 also equals 1. And that's because this gate with label 0, 0 at layer 1, sorry, I forgot to put the subscripts on add and mult here. This was add for layer 0, this was mult for layer 1. This is because this gate with label 0, 0 at layer 1 is a multiplication gate, which computes the product of the gates with label 0, 0 at layer 2. Yeah, and then if I change anything about this, about these two input gate labels from 0, 0 to I don't know, this would then become 0, right? Because the second input, the second wire feeding into this gate with label 0, 0 at layer 1 is not of label 0, 1. It's of label 0, 0. So mult would say, you feed at this input, and it's like, no, I'm not putting 0 because, this gate at layer 1 does not compute the product of these two gates at layer 2. Any questions about this? Okay, so it's a little bit nasty notation, but it sounds like the example at least, made things clear enough. No one's asking anything. I will say we will soon see, not very long in the future, a snark that is very related to this protocol we're seeing today. But rather than kind of going layer by layer through the circuit, it's sort of the prover proves the whole circuit all at once. And so like these functions like add and mult will come up in that snark, but there'll only be one. There'll be one function add for the whole circuit, one function mult for the whole circuit. So you won't need a different function for every layer. Unfortunately, if you want to treat the whole circuit, like you want to prove the whole circuit all at once, it seems you need to use cryptography. So you don't get an interactive proof out of it. So the GKR protocol is an interactive proof. It uses no cryptography at all. Okay, and this is actually, I've been sort of trying to evangelize the sum-check protocol for a long time. And this has long been like the selling point of the sum-check protocol is it's accomplishing like an incredible feat, offloading very hard work to the prover so the verifier doesn't have to do it. And the key thing that differentiates it from a lot of the other techniques in use today is the prover is not cryptographically committing to anything. And that is often the bottleneck in snarks. So the magical thing here is the prover is basically proving it correctly evaluated the circuit gate by gate. So it's proving it correctly materialized like intermediate values in the computation, those intermediate values being the non-output gates of the circuit, like 9, 4, 6, 1, like those values. It's proving it correctly materialized those values without sending them to the verifier, and moreover, without even sending a commitment to those values to the verifier. And basically anything else out there the very first thing the prover would do is commit to the value of every single gate in the circuit cryptographically. And that would be at least the lower bound on the prover's runtime is the cost to compute that cryptographic commitment. And in many snarks, it's the bottleneck. So that's why that's one reason why I'm covering this now. But it is a more complicated protocol with an add and mult function for each layer of the circuit rather than one for the whole circuit. The reason it has to do that is basically because it eschews the use of cryptography completely. Okay, so that's all the notation. Now, because these functions are defined over the Boolean hypercube, because the gate labels are 0, 1 value, I can take their multilinear extensions. Okay, so that's all the notation. Now the key is, I'm now going to explain to you, how this reduction is done. Remember coming up a little higher on the screen the prover starts by sending the claimed outputs. The verifier evaluates the multilinear extension of the claimed outputs at a random point. And then I said they use the sum-check protocol to reduce, kind of checking the validity of that evaluation to an analogous claim about the gates feeding into the output. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you what they apply the sum-check protocol to, and where the polynomial that they apply the sum-check protocol to, where it comes from is we're going to express y twiddle as a sum. Okay, and this is closely analogous to multilinear Lagrange interpolation, which is one reason why I reviewed it at the start. So with multilinear Lagrange interpolation, we express the multilinear extension of y twiddle in a nice way, as like a weighted sum of Lagrange basis polynomials, right? We're going to do something very similar. It's just we're not going to be using Lagrange basis polynomials. We'll do something else. We'll do something else involving the values of the gates feeding into the output. And so the sum-check protocol, like exactly what it does is compute a big sum. So we'll apply the sum-check protocol to compute that big sum. Okay, so what I now need to do is give you the explicit expression for y twiddle, the multilinear extension of the outputs. So let me come down and do that. Okay. All right. So remember, let me just draw the two output gates again. I think it was I think there was 9 feeding into it and 4 feeding into it, and 6 and 1, I think. Okay, and yeah, these, let's just put it that way. Okay, and remember, these gate values were given, so these get 13 and 7, and I call this vector W0 and this vector W1. Okay, here we go. So I claim that W0 twiddle of R, and this is just because there are only 2 outputs, there's R is just one field element, equal, okay, the sum over all pairs of gates at the preceding layer, at layer W1. So BC in 0, 1 to the log width of W, like length of W1. Let me just say length of, I don't know. I'm going to write W1 here, like in absolute value. This I mean 4, because there are 4 gates at this level. So apologies for the gross notation there. I think in the book I called this K1 or something, but anyway. So I'm just summing over gate labels, or pairs of gate labels, pairs of gates at the gates feeding into the output gates. Okay, so I sum over pairs of gates, and we have, so we're going to do add twiddle of R, comma B, comma C, okay, times, it's going to look a little gross, but it's conceptually actually very simple, so just bear with me as I do the gross thing. So we got W1 twiddle of B plus W1 twiddle of C. Okay, great. And then, okay, so that's sort of like, let me just put a box around that. That's like one part of the term of the sum. And then the other part is going to be mod twiddle of R, comma B, comma C times W1 twiddle of B times W1 twiddle of C. And let me just put a box around that so you can sort of conceptualize that as a separate thing. Great. Okay. So, this is a little bit of a gross sum, but all it's saying is it's doing something very similar to multilinear Lagrange interpolation. Okay. So, remember to confirm that this equality holds. So let's call this a claim. We need to check 2 things. One is we need to check that the right-hand side, so this polynomial here, which is as expressed as a big sum, we need to check that the right-hand side is multilinear in R. And 2, we have to check that W0, it has the right-hand side has the appropriate behavior at the interpolating set. So I'll just say right-hand side has necessary behavior over the interpolating set, which means for all R in 0, 1, in general it would be 0, 1 to the log number of outputs, which I'd be calling W0, but here log number of outputs is just 1 in this case. Okay. Because remember, if we confirm that a polynomial is multilinear and has the desired behavior over the interpolating set, then it must be the multilinear extension of the thing we are seeking the multilinear extension of. Because multilinear extensions are unique. Okay, so checking that it's multilinear is easy, right? So you only see R getting fed into add twiddle and mod twiddle, and by definition, add twiddle and mod twiddle have degree 1 in each variable. They're multilinear. So that means that this whole thing in green has degree 1 in R. So the whole thing in green is multilinear in R. So check, that's it. It's basically immediate from the fact that R only gets fed into add twiddle and mod twiddle, and they are by definition multilinear. Okay, any questions about that? Cool. Okay, so now we get to the nasty thing, and we sort of wrote this sum explicitly so that 2 would hold, but let me try to explain it. So let's imagine, let's consider an R that is Boolean, so that is it's a gate label. So you think of R now as like the either 0 or 1, so it's either the label of this applicate or this applicate. All right, so these happen to both be addition gates. Yeah, okay, so that's fine. So they're both addition gates, which means that for any B and C in 0, 1 to the log, size of W1, which is log of 4, mod twiddle of R comma B comma C will be 0, right? And that's because remember mod twiddle when you evaluated at a Boolean input was 1 if A is a multiplication gate and B and C are its in neighbors, and so that is it computes the product of B and C, gates B and C at the preceding layer. But because we only have addition gates at the layer under consideration here, no matter which of the two gate labels 0 or 1 we feed into malt, and no matter what B and C are, it'll spit out 0, right? Because they're just R will be A will be an addition gate, not a multiplication gate. Okay. But now, so now consider gate 0, let's say. So R is 0. Okay, now if you feed into add twiddle the two actual in neighbors of that gate, so if you feed into it 0, 0 for B and 0, 1 for C, add twiddle of 0, 0, 0, 0, 1 will spit out 1. Okay, and when it spits out 1, that 1 gets multiplied by the two, W1 twiddle B plus W1 twiddle C, which is exactly the sum of the two gates that, gate R is meant to sum. So it spits out exactly the right thing in that case, right? And if you, for any other B and C, any other pair of gate labels B and C, gates that R is not supposed to sum, add twiddle, evaluate it to 0, and so it doesn't matter that in that case W1 twiddle B plus W1 twiddle C is not what we want, because you get here's something bad, but it gets multiplied by 0. So I mean that's it. That's what's going on. So you think of just as multilinear Lagrange interpolation sort of summed over every element of the interpolating set, and multiplied by the appropriate coefficients for that element of the interpolating set times this Lagrange basis polynomial that sort of indicated are you equal to this element or not. This add twiddle thing and mod twiddle, this is like some analog of the Lagrange basis polynomial. It's like picking out exactly the right B and C. It picks out the B and C that are the in neighbors of R if R is Boolean. And then in that case, the add twiddle or mod twiddle spits out 1, and that 1 gets multiplied by exactly what we want, namely either the sum of the two in neighbors or the product of the two in neighbors, depending on whether R is an addition gate or a multiplication gate. Okay. Did that make sense? Anyone have questions about this equality and why it's true?
Yeah, so we have a separate add and multiply function for each layer, right?
Yes. So, yeah, thank you. So this should have been add 0 and mod 0. I always forget it because these days I mainly work on the snarks that hit the circuit all at once, and then there's not a separate one for each layer. So, yeah, thanks for catching that. And
About I guess the way it's defined here, you kind of have one combined gate function, and you could imagine basically setting up a gate which does both addition and multiplication, and then those two could get added together. It seems like you could, I guess you would have a complete system if you removed the add function, or would you now have an incomplete system? Because it seems like you could use the multiplication function as long as you have a constant of 1 somewhere in the input, like R1CS. In fact, this actually might be R1CS. Mhm.
I think you're pointing out. I think multiplication alone is actually like a universal gate set. Because like you said, like you can simulate multiplication, repeated addition, right? So if you multiply, you should be able to add things with multiplication alone.
That actually very, very interesting. Although that's not exactly what I'm thinking about right here. What I'm thinking about right here actually is because you have this outer sum. The outer sum basically allows you to add an arbitrary number of multiplied things from the layer previous. And so basically you can use that as an implicit add as part of your circuit.
I see. I'm not quite sure that works.
Okay.
It's worked out more. I can say, there are things you could do with the GKR protocol. Like if you have like a binary tree of sum gates, each of, fan and two or whatever, fan and two just means, two, each gate is summing up two things. They're basically just computing one big sum. And so this is just like one giant sum. And so, and I actually put this in, observed this in some paper a long time ago. Anyone using the GKR protocol would be kind of foolish to just literally apply the GKR protocol here. They should just apply sum check once to the whole sum, which is kind of exactly the sort of thing you're saying here. The details of what you're saying, I'm not sure. They might or might not work out.
Okay.
But you are totally right. Also, like, you're getting at something else, which I think it came up before, but is worth revisiting, which is there's nothing super special about add and mult here. You could have like a fourth power gate, to the fourth, which takes as input like only one input, I guess. So I guess you just have kind of R comma B here and sort of ignore C. And then have like W1 twiddle of B to the fourth, right? And this would work fine. So when you ultimately, we're going to apply the sum check protocol to like compute this big sum, and it will, increase the degree of the polynomial sent in each round from something like, I think maybe 2 or 3, it'll increase it to like 4 or 5. But it's actually turns out to often be like a net win. So you should be aware that like you can come into like, muck with the guts of this protocol, but fairly straightforwardly to handle gates that go well beyond addition and multiplication. And in a sense, like I put out this new paper recently, kind of introducing a new kind of circuit, we call it an intermediate representation, called CCS, and it's really doing something like that, and trying to explain that sum check based snarks that already exist, sort of, just by doing things like just mucking with the guts of them in ways that are not actually very complicated, can handle all of the kinds of circuits, high degree gates, constraints, whatever that people like to use in practice today, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Cool. Any other questions? All right. Okay. So great. So we have this like complicated expression for W0 twiddle. The expression itself now has been sort of barely legible because I've circled things so many times, but like here it is. So what we're going to do is we're just going to apply the sum check protocol to compute the sum. So let me just come down here and like write it again. So I'm literally going to just write it from scratch. I can do it very quickly. You sum over BC and 0, 1 to the log of the width of layer 1 of add twiddle. RBC, W1 twiddle of B plus W1 twiddle C, plus mult twiddle. So same thing, just with mult, and place plus with times. Cool. Okay. So what we will do is to compute W0 total of R, we will apply sum check to the polynomial G of BC defined as follows. So it's the thing being summed here, but I think it's helpful to write it out. So add twiddle of R, comma B, comma C. So note at this point, R has been fixed by the verifier. Like R, you remember at the start of the protocol, the verifier picked R at random and evaluated, the claimed outputs multilinear extension at R and sent R. So V computed this on its own and sent R to the prover. So the prover knows R is fixed. But B and C are variables still. So R is like bound to some fixed field element. B and C are variables. So G of BC is add twiddle RBC, W1 twiddle of B plus W1 twiddle C plus mult twiddle RBC, W1 twiddle of B times W1 twiddle of C. So you apply sum check to this thing. So it's kind of gross, right? But I mean, it's a polynomial in two times log width of layer one many variables. Its degree in each variable is 2. Like you can look the degree, because add twiddle and W1 twiddle are multilinear, the degree in B is 2. The degree in C is 2, and I mean in each variable will be in each variable C, because keep in mind, like in general, each of these R, B, C, I'm using one letter for each, but they're each actually consists of, R is like log number of outputs, many field elements, and B and C are log like the width of layer one many field elements. So do keep that in mind. These are not, B is not one variable, B is potentially several variables. So this is just a polynomial in 2 times log width of layer 1 many variables, degree 2 in each variable. So you apply sum check to it. The total proof, so the number of rounds is equal to the number of variables. In each round, the prover sends a univariate polynomial of degree equal to 2. So the proof length then is basically 3 times the number of rounds, which is something like 3 times 2 times log the width of W1, something like that. So that is the proof length of applying sum check at this particular layer. Great. And so at the end of sum check, the verifier has to evaluate G at a random point. So let me call that random point. The notation is kind of gross because we're going to later have to do this, for the next layer and the next layer and the next layer. So technically you have to carry around, notation to indicate what layer we're at, but it's just a nuisance. Let me just call it, R1, R2. So I'm not really indicating what layer we're at. Each of these are in, R1, R2 together is in field of the 2 times log width of layer 1. Okay, and so to evaluate G at R1, R2, right, it suffices to evaluate W1 twiddle at R1. So V needs W1 twiddle at R1, it needs W1 twiddle at R2. It also needs add twiddle at R, R1, R2, and mod twiddle at R, R1, R2. Okay. For many circuits, I'm just going to assert for the moment that the verifier can get these on its own. Basically, if the circuit has like a lot of repeated structure, that will be the case. I'll say more about this shortly. So let's just assume right now that V can compute these add twiddle and mod twiddle evaluations on its own in, let's say, log circuit size time or something like that. So we're going to, the verifier is going to take time like depth times log circuit size just to check the proof. So, we're perfectly happy for the verifier to spend log circuit size time evaluating add twiddle and mod twiddle at the point it needs to evaluate G of R1 or R2. I'll come back to that in a moment. But the verifier really does have a problem in needing to evaluate W1 twiddle of R1 and W1 twiddle of R2 because it doesn't know the vector W1, right? It doesn't actually know the vector of gate values in this example 9461, because that would require evaluating the whole circuit other than the output gates, which is almost as hard as evaluating the whole circuit, including the output gates. And so that's why the verifier is not done at this point. It's going to have to apply some check again to reduce the claim about the gates at layer 1 to a claim about the gates at layer 2. Okay, now there's just one more sticking point, which is we started with the claim about W0 twiddle at R, and we've now reduced it in the sense I explained before to a claim about W1 twiddle at 2 points, W1 twiddle of R1 and W1 twiddle of R2. And that's no good, because it doubled the number of points, and if we were to kind of naively apply the same protocol again to reduce the claim about layer 1 to the claim about layer 2, it would double the points again from 2 to 4. And if you keep doing this 4 to 8, 8 to 16, the number of points explodes to be as big as the circuit is, basically. Sorry, my pen just stopped working again, so let me try to fix that. Know what's up with that. So we need to address this issue that there are these 2 points, R1, R2, that the verifier needs to evaluate W1 twiddle at. We really need to bring that down to 1 point. Not a great time for the pen to stop working. It's a new pen. I think I'm fully charged. Let me check that. iPad's charged. Pen charged? Back in business. Sorry about that. Okay, so we need a technique to sort of reduce 2 claims about W1 twiddles evaluations to 1. Okay, so the book actually presents this, and I probably should have done this today as like a self-contained sub-routine, which it actually presents before the GKR protocol. I probably should have done it today. So I'm just going to, since we're almost out of time, and I know probably some of you have to go, I'm just going to do it by picture right now. So here's the technique to sort of reduce, for the verifier to sort of reduce the need to check 2 evaluations of W1 twiddle to the need to just checking 1 evaluation of W1 twiddle. Okay, remember, R1 and R2, they live in field to the... come on. They bringing the pen back again. They live in field to the log of the width of layer 1. Okay, so I'm out of battery. Wow, I've never ran out of battery on this pen. I'll just leave it here for a second. You know what? While we wait for the pen to charge for just 1 minute. Hopefully that'll get us through the last 5 minutes of this session. Why don't I jump to add twiddle and lock twiddle being efficiently evaluatable? Okay, so many of the things people apply snarks to today, at least, they do the same simple thing over and over again. As an example, say a roll-up, one of the main things a roll-up has to do is prove knowledge of a Merkle authentication path. So that authentication path just consists of a bunch of hash outputs. And confirming that the hash outputs are valid, basically what the circuit has to do is just compute a bunch of hashes, right? So all the circuit is doing is computing, KSAC over and over and over again, right? You wind up with that situation a lot. It would be helpful to have the pen, but where your circuit is basically just, you have this little tiny sub-circuit, which say evaluates Poseidon or KSAC or something many, many times. And you just do it kind of independently on a different input. So you just do the same little thing over and over and over again and, produce an output for each. Now, when I say little, Poseidon is hundreds of constraints, and SHA is thousands of constraints, and blah 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 blah. Right. So little, is a relative statement. And yeah, I mean, you do if it's too simple, then even just reading the output is like as expensive as computing the whole all of it. I guess with the Merkle authentication paths, like you may have many hash outputs, and then they're sort of all checked for consistency. So there's some like post-processing of them, aggregation phase or something. And so the final output is just like a big bit, like yes, the authentication path was valid, or no, it's not. So 0 or 1, let's say. Okay, and that way the verifier doesn't have to read all of these outputs of these hash functions. Great. So often circuits look like this, and I call this data parallel. Okay, and even when they're not data parallel, they often still have repeated structure. Like if you're like if the prover's claiming to have run like a computer program, say for the RISC-V instruction set for 1 million steps, like you're basically like kind of applying like the transition function of the RISC-V CPU, 1 million times, like once per step. So then it won't be data parallel, it'll actually be like highly sequential, but it's still repeated structure where it's, like each little box here is just like, execute, the RISC-V, like one step of the RISC-V virtual machine for one step or whatever. It's like the transition function of the RISC-V virtual machine. So yeah, like almost everything people are doing today is just something simple repeated many times. Okay, so let me stick with the data parallel stuff. So in that case, like add twiddle, like of ABC, can be factored into a product of two things. So it'd be like add twiddle, like so you think of each gate label, A, B, and C, as consisting of two pieces. Let's say A0 and A1, where A0 tells you like what copy of the subcircuit you're in, what copy of the little simple thing you're in, so like, if you're evaluating a hash function 1 million times, it's saying like which instance of the hash function are you, regarding here. And then A1 would tell you like what gate within the copy. And similarly for B and C. So every gate label has two pieces. What copy of the little subcomputation are you in, and where are you within the copy? And then add twiddle can be factored as you just apply the add twiddle function just for the simple thing. So add twiddle like for the simple thing only of A1, B1, C1. Okay, times the multilinear extension of the equality function that just checks that all three gates A, B, and C are in the same copy of the simple thing. A0, B0, C0. Okay, this is actually something, it looks almost exactly like a Lagrange basis polynomial, and the key point is this can be evaluated in logarithmic time. So log number of copies of the subcomputation time. Okay, so even if the subcomputation itself is very, has no repeated structure or anything like that, at least the complexity of evaluating add twiddle is completely independent of the number of copies, right? So like if you apply SHA or KSAC or something 1 billion times, right? Like, yes, you might kind of have to process the circuit computing SHA or KSAC or whatever it is once, but the verifier does not have to process it like 1 billion times, right? It's sort of the number of copies, the verifier's runtime only grows like an additive logarithmic term in the number of copies. And something similar turns out to happen here. And in fact, people actually, when dealing with multilinear extensions, no one had really worked out that the same thing holds until this new paper on CCS. So Yeah, with univariate polynomials, people had already kind of worked out how to make sure that these like add twiddle and mod twiddle sort of things, the analogs of them in like univariate polynomial based snarks, like Starks and Planck and stuff like that. Well, not Planck because that does have pre-processing, but anyway, it was known, for some univariate based techniques, how to deal with this sort of thing. And just no one had really worked it out for multilinear things. So the CCS paper has a little section that does it. Yeah. So high level point, circuits with repeated structure, they're kind of very uniform in a sense. The verifier will indeed be able to evaluate add twiddle and mod twiddle on its own very quickly. So we don't have to worry about this. And I just mentioned, if that happens to not be the case, there are other things you can do. Like you can have a sort of a trusted entity in pre-processing commit to these polynomials so that the prover can be forced to provide the evaluations even though the prover is not trusted. And the verifier just has to check like a proof, the polynomial commitments evaluation proof, that the provided evaluations are correct. And this sort of thing is done in Marlin and in Spartan. They precisely have someone in pre-processing, Marlin calls it the indexer, commit to like these wiring polynomials. In Marlin, they're bivariate, not multilinear, so that the prover can then be forced to provide those evaluations. And the verifier just has to kind of check the proof of that. And Planck does something very similar, but kind of avoids the full abstraction that I just described here. Happy to say more about that some other time when I haven't gone way over time. Okay, does anyone want to ask anything about that before I talk about reducing the two claims to one, about W1 to a single claim?
Yeah, I guess so in the general case, in the unstructured case, add and mult basically are descriptions of the circuit and therefore the size of the circuit. Is that correct?
That's exactly right, which is why, in general, you just cannot, the verifier at least has to know what circuit the prover is claiming to have evaluated. So in general, you cannot avoid linear verifier time. But if you use cryptography, you can push that linear time to like a pre-processing phase that only depends on the circuit and not on the input the circuit's ultimately evaluated at. And that's really any project that's using Planck or Marlin today. They're doing something like that. Basically in a roll-up context, I guess, like the company that posts the smart contract has kind of baked a commitment to add twiddle or mod twiddle into the smart contract. So that the prover can be forced as part of like the proof online to provide the necessary evaluations of them. And I'm hand waving because Planck itself doesn't, and Marlin, they don't actually involve these particular polynomials, but they involve like conceptually analogous polynomials. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. That's often referred to as like the verifier key, right? They said this like commitment to the circuit that essentially is a pre-processing on the like wiring polynomial, as I guess what I sometimes hear it referred to. Oh no, it's not. I'm mixing up metaphors for things.
No, I think you're right. I think that term verification key is often used in the context of trusted setup-based snarks, and for them, there might be like additional parts to the verification key. But like even something like Spartan. And and Marlin can also, Marlin and Planck can also use transparent schemes. They just choose to use KZG, which needs a trusted setup. But anyway, so even if you did use a transparent commitment scheme like Bulletproof or something in Marlin and Planck, well, Bulletproof's the verifier's linear time anyway. Okay, another transparent commitment scheme, Dory, Fry, whatever. If you want to handle general circuits completely unstructured, and you don't want the verifier to kind of have to take linear time online to evaluate these polynomials at the necessary points, you would have someone commit to them in pre-processing, and I think it would be reasonable to call that like the verification key. And indeed, like Plonky2 and Redshift, that's exactly what they do, because they take Plonk and they replace KZG with Fry, and that's what they do. So they still have like a quote verification key, but it's not coming from any trusted setup. There is no trusted setup. It's coming from a transparent preprocessing phase. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously the difference between a trusted setup that has to be done like ahead of time by trusted ceremony or trusted group of people, and then the transparent stuff often it's baked into like build chains and whatnot, and gets done by the client before the as a preprocessing step. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think what you said is right. I guess it's a little subtle. So a trusted setup, the key is that there's like some toxic waste where if everyone got together who participated in the ceremony and sort of combined their share of the toxic waste rather than disposing of it, they could easily find convincing proofs of false statements forevermore. And that sort of thing, actually, like Zcash sort of messed up their trusted setup in a sense. People didn't come and like, all get together and cheat. They just literally like generated the wrong structure reference string. With a transparent setup of this form, like what's used in Plonky2, say, or I guess Polygon ZKEVM is essentially doing this too. There's no toxic waste, okay? But it is the case that someone honest has to compute the commitments to add twiddle and mock twiddle, right? Because if someone dishonest did it, then they could commit to a different circuit, right? And the prover could, successfully prove statements about that circuit, and the verifier thinks it's proving statements about, the other circuit. So it's still the case with this stuff, and people will call this like, holography or computation commitments, this committing and pre-processing to twiddle and mark twiddle. Even if it's a transparent commitment scheme, there's no trusted setup, it's still the case that someone honest better commit to these polynomials, because otherwise they might commit to the polynomials capturing a different circuit. So that's the one that I wanted to clarify.
Yeah, right, that's great.
Yeah. I actually suspect that, no one goes to like ZK Sync or, any of these rollups that do things like this and like confirms that they've committed to the correct circuit. But the point is they could. I doubt they do, but they could. So, you don't really have to trust whoever commits to these. But I suspect in practice, everyone is just trusting that, whoever committed to them did it correctly. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Any other questions about add twiddle and mock twiddle? All right. Yeah, and again, for everything but the GKR protocol, there's only one add twiddle and mock twiddle for the whole circuit rather than one per layer of the circuit. Okay, so yeah, let's talk about this sort of reduction from the verifier needing to know W1 twiddle of R1 and W1 twiddle of R2 to only needing to know W1 twiddle of a single other point. So yeah, R1 and R2, they live in field to the log of the width of layer 1. And so let me just pick 2 points in this space, call one R1 and one R2. Okay, so like regardless of the dimensionality of the space, it always makes sense to talk about a line through any 2 points. Okay, I'll do a quick example. Let's say R1, I'll do it in 2-dimensional space. R1 is, 0, 2, and R2 is 1, 3. Then I guess the line through them would be, so it's parameterized by a single field element T. T tells you like where on the line you are. So there are field size many points on this line. And so T would map to, if I can do this right, I guess just T, 0 map, yeah. And so here 0 is going to map to 0 and 1 will map to 1. And so then we want 0 to map to 2. I guess it'd be 2 plus T. Yeah, I think that's it. So you'll see that. So 0, under this definition, 0 maps to 0, 2, and 1 maps to 1, 3. Yeah, so this T, 2 plus T is the line that passes through these 2 points, R1 and R2, even though these 2 points live in two-dimensional space rather than one-dimensional space. So we're used to one-dimensional lines, but here we have a two-dimensional line. Okay. And essentially what the verifier demands is that the prover send W1 twiddle restricted to this line. So like composed with this line. So in this example that I drew right here, this would be W1 twiddle of T comma 2 plus T. Okay, that's what it means to restrict W1 twiddle to this line. You just literally feed the line into W1 twiddle. And this is a univariate polynomial whose degree is at most the number of variables of W1 twiddle. This is using the fact that W1 twiddle has degree at most 1 in each variable. So that would be, log width of W1, the log width to layer 1 many. That's the degree. So just as an example, if W1 twiddle of, I don't know, you have to come up with 2 variable names. D and D, I don't know, were, C times D plus 3C plus D, then W1 twiddle restricted to the line in this example would be, T times 2 plus T, so you just plug in T for C and 2 plus T for D. So plus 3 times T plus 2 plus T. And this is you do some algebra and you get out a degree 2 polynomial, right? That's all this is saying is that W1 twiddle restricted to this line is a univariate polynomial with degree at most the number of variables of W1 twiddle, which in this example is 2. So it's probably not helpful for me to work out the algebra, but T squared plus, looks like it's 6T plus 2 or something. Anyway, so if the prover's honest, like this is what it would send this univariate polynomial to the verifier. Okay, and then what the verifier will do is pick a random T. So it picks a random point on the line. Okay, and let's and sort of the final claim. So and how am I saying this? Sorry, I forgot to mention something. So because R1 and R2 are on the line by definition, we define the line to be the line through R1 and R2. By sending W1 twiddle restricted to the line, the prover is implicitly making a claim about W1 twiddle of R1 and W1 twiddle of R2. So since I parameterize things in this example so that, R1 is parameterized by 0, T equals 0, and R2 is parameterized by T equals 1, so the verifier interprets, under this parameterization I chose, this univariate, let me call this univariate polynomial of P, interprets P of 0 as the prover's claim for W1 twiddle of R1, and P of 1 as the prover's claim for W1 twiddle of R2. And that's because if the prover's honest, this will be the case, right? Because, 0, T equals 0, get parameterized as 0.02 on the line, and in particular, which set T equals 0, you feed into W1 0, 2, which is exactly R1, right? So, so by demanding that the prover send W1 twiddle restricted to this line that passes through R1 and R2, the prover inherently has to make a claim as to W1's value at R1 and W1 twiddle's value at R2. Okay, and then finally, the verifier picks a random other point on the line, which is equivalent to picking a random T from the field. Okay, and chooses to believe that, these values are accurate. So P0 indeed equals W1 twiddle over R1, and P1 indeed is like the correct value of W1 twiddle over R2, so long as V, is convinced via subsequent rounds that W1 twiddle of, so in this example it would just be t comma 2 plus t equals p of t, right? So what's happening in the picture is the prover is forced to make a claim, by sending W1 twiddle restricted to this line, the prover is forced to make a claim about W1 twiddle at R1 and W1 twiddle at R2. And then the verifier just picks a random other point on the line and says, okay, I'm going to believe your claim about R1 and R2 as long as you can convince me that your claim about T is correct. Okay. And the reason it's safe to believe the claim about R1 and R2, so long as the verifier is convinced of the claim about T, is because it's just standard like short Zipple type stuff, except everything's univariate here, right? So if the prover, if P does not equal W1 twiddle restricted to the line, then with high probability over the random choice of T, so T chosen at random from the field, P of T does not equal W1 twiddle of the line evaluated at T. So let me just call that, L of T. L of T is just the point on the line. L of T is this point here, the point on the line parameterized by T. It's a random point, it's a random point on the line. Right? So, basically, if the verifier is convinced that indeed P of T equals W1 twiddle of L of T, right, then the verifier is in fact convinced that P equals W1 twiddle. And if P equals W1 twiddle, then these two claims are valid about R1 and R2. Okay. So that's the GKR protocol. I know I took way more time than I wanted, so thank you for sticking around till the bitter end. But just to summarize, in the protocol, so let's say we had these two output gates. I guess they were addition gates. I don't want to draw the whole circuit again since it's so late, but you get the idea. So the prover started by sending the claim values of the outputs. We called that W10. The verifier immediately evaluated the Moss-Henner extension of that at a random point. We then applied the sum check protocol to some, other polynomial like G of B comma C, where you should kind of think of B and C as the labels of two gates at the preceding layer. And at the end of the sum check protocol, the verifier had to evaluate G at a random point, which necessitated evaluating W1 twiddle at two random points, as well as add zero twiddle and mod zero twiddle at a certain points. And I explained that most of the time in practice, the verifier on its own can get add twiddle and mod twiddle's evaluations. And we talked about what you can do if that's not the case, involving this, pre-processing stuff. I then explained how the verifier can reduce checking these two claims to checking a single claim about W1 twiddle of R3. Great. And so we have successfully reduced the claim about W0 twiddle of R to a claim about W1 twiddle of R3. And now we just repeat. We literally apply the sum check protocol just again to the same polynomial, but just with different layers at play. So rather than using G of DC for that we did as I walked through this protocol, we use a different G prime of BC. Now these are labels of gates at layer 2 rather than 1. And it's really the same thing. So you sum over, what was it? You apply sum check to G of BC. So G itself doesn't have the sum in it, but anyway, it's, so just add one twiddle of R3 comma B comma C times W2 twiddle of B plus W2 twiddle C, and I'll skip the moth stuff. Literally all that changed was, the layers. Now B and C are sort of indexing gates at layer 2 rather than layer 1. R3 is a random vector of field elements. The number of entries is the log of the width of layer 1 rather than the list of the gates at layer 0, and you're dealing with add 1 and mulk 1 instead of add 0 and mulk 0. Yeah, so you just keep doing this. This would reduce to a claim about W2 twiddle of some other point. I don't feel like giving that point a name. And so you just go layer by layer through the circuit until eventually the prover is forced to make a claim about WD twiddle of some point. And WD twiddle, remember, is just the multi-unit extension of the input itself, and the verifier can check that claim on its own in order and time, linear in the size of the input. That is the GKR protocol in full. So, yeah, let me know if you have any questions. Tyler, I think I covered probably too much for one session, but you stuck around, so hopefully it was productive anyway. Yeah, I can hang around for a bit if there are more questions, but that's everything for today. Any questions?
I'm just wondering, because in the pinned message over there, I saw there's gonna be like implementation week and the reading week. Are we still doing that, or are we just doing reading weeks all the time?
So last time through the book, we had talked about implementations. I don't know if it's still pinned all this time later. It's been like a year or something. And it kind of fizzled a bit. So I guess I don't have plans to do implementation weeks, but if there's interest, we can discuss that. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I mean, I've been doing, like, I did implemented the sum check with the triangles with the Piaget and all that. So, I mean, I guess I was thinking about trying to do this one as well. This one, yeah. So I was going to implement this one as well.
Okay. So I mean, there's definitely others who have been working through implementations and would definitely be happy to I think compare and talk.
Oh yeah, I was just wondering. It's not I don't need it, But.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we should just coordinate in the chat. And I didn't have plans to spend sessions during this time discussing the implementations, but it probably would be extremely valuable to do that a little bit. So maybe let's just take the conversation offline, and but I'm really open to suggestions, and I think we probably should do some of that, if not during these sessions, then if people can meet up another day of the week or something.
Okay. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks
you.
for it. Yep. Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks again for the whole 2-hour session. So I think next week we're going to start talking about polynomial commitment schemes and quickly get to snarks. So that's exciting. So I will see you all next week, and have a great weekend in the meantime.
Have a great weekend. Bye.
Have a good one. Bye.